Hi there, I'm Dr. Suzie Hudson and I'm the Clinical Director here at NADA. Welcome to this series of videos that will explore various elements of NADAbase, the data that we need to capture, the way in which to do it, so that we can absolutely ensure that our clients and consumers feel comfortable and that we've got all the right information to inform the best quality care that we can provide them. Today's series will be specifically on asking questions around gender and sexuality. We'll take you through the various elements, why we ask the question, and also some role plays that will demonstrate to you the ways in which we can making sure that our clients feel comfortable and that we can engage them in why we're asking the question. Asking the question, gender and sexuality. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today. And NADA proudly acknowledges the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay our respects to elders past, present and future generations. I'd also like to introduce to you the NADAbase team, Rosemary Miller and Tata de Jesus, and myself, Suzie Hudson. We're here for you to support you in anything to do with NADAbase and would encourage you to contact us at any time. I'd like to thank my colleagues for pulling together this presentation and for their input and support throughout NADAbase for our members. So the key learning objectives today are really about understanding the importance of asking about people's gender and sexuality in drug and alcohol settings. It'll be also to explore approaches on talking about gender and sexuality and collecting data relevant to your client's treatment journey. It also fits very nicely with parts of the NADA capability framework and reflects the capabilities of Domain 3, Access and Equity, Domain 4, Ethical, Safe and Responsible Practice, and Domain 6, Treatment Interventions. In terms of an overview, we're going to talk a little bit about why we ask about gender and sexuality. We're going to explore gender and sexuality in NADAbase itself. We're going to actually also tap into some member perspectives to hear from them about how they have incorporated this into their clinical work. And we'll be conducting some role plays on really asking the question to help you visualise and understand the better ways to make your clients feel comfortable in the treatment setting. So why is gender and sexuality data important? We know that for many people who identify as gender or sexuality diverse, they can experience increased use and difficulties associated with substance use more broadly. We know that there is also a lot of stigma and discrimination attached to identifying as sexuality or gender diverse, and it's our job in the drug and alcohol sector to do everything we can to ensure people feel comfortable, safe, and that we provide them the treatment that responds to their needs. And that's why it's so vital that we ask the question, that we signal to them that this is a safe place where they can be cared for and they can be linked to all the services that they need in the course of their treatment journey. We also know that around 2 in 5 people identifying as homosexual or bisexual recently used any illicit drugs. And indeed, a lot of the data we do have, we know that there's a lot of voices missing because we aren't routinely asking questions around gender and sexuality diversity. And so what we need to be doing is ensuring that people from all spaces have an opportunity to be heard and that we are responding in the adequate ways. We also know that a proportion of people who identify as homosexual or bisexual who smoke daily is 16%. And without asking these questions and providing an opportunity, we know too that people will frequently wait quite a considerable period longer to reach out for assistance. And in that place, we know that they can frequently, those issues can be exacerbated. And so it's our job to ensure that people feel like treatment is for everybody. We also know that it's becoming increasingly important for the drug and alcohol sector We have seen some changes in the national minimum data set, certainly around places where people can identify if they don't identify as male or female. But we know that it's not enough. And that's why here at NADA and in some other places across the drug and alcohol sector, people have been quite proactive to be inclusive of asking about sexual orientation and asking about gender diversity. We know also that there's an increasing number of NADAbase and data support requests around data and sexuality questions. And so that was a reason for putting together this particular video, but also for producing a range of supportive resources that we'll be able to show you at the end of this presentation. We also know that for some organisations, they are specifically funded to provide services that are oriented and safe for people from gender and sexuality diverse backgrounds. And so we hope that for the whole of the treatment sector, that this becomes an open, inclusive and accessible place for everyone. I'd like to hand over now to my colleague Rose, and she's going to take you through NADAbase specifically, what questions are contained there, and start the process of thinking about how to engage this and implement it into your practice.
Hi, I'm Dr. Rose Miller, and I'm NADA's Research and Data Management Officer. Today I'm going to talk with you about the items that are currently included in NADAbase for gender and sexuality. The minimum data set is the information that's required for staff from AOD services to collect from the clients that engage their services. So you usually encounter this in the form of, say, a treatment episode, and you enter the information for a treatment episode into NADAbase, or if you're a NADAbase importer, your service would import that data to NADAbase. Now, the client's sex is a mandatory item for the MDS. And in 2016, NADA introduced a few more options to this particular item so that clients had more options when disclosing their sex or gender identity. So these additional options for this item that were included were intersex, transgender male, transgender female, or non-binary indeterminate. And we've got the definitions up on the screen. Now, I just want to emphasize here that we're not claiming that these options are completely comprehensive. It's entirely possible that a person's sex or gender identity is not encapsulated by these options. However, we see this as a starting point so that services and clients have a bit more room to record more information and for that information to be used for that client on their treatment journey or for the service that is being delivered to them. Now in 2016, another item was introduced to this section of the episode information in NADAbase. This was sexuality. Now I just want to emphasize again too that sexuality is not a mandatory item for the MDS. But again, NADA decided to include it in the NADAbase because we could see that this could be important information for services to be able to access when treating or delivering services to their clients. So the options for this particular item are straight or heterosexual, lesbian, gay or homosexual, bisexual, queer, and that's the ones that are included at this stage. Now you'll notice that for the sex, gender or the sexuality items, there's also options for clients to put not stated or inadequately described, and we're going to come back to those options. So that's whether the client has not provided that information or not stated it, or perhaps the question hasn't been asked about their sexuality or their gender identity. And again, on this slide, we've also included the definitions that are used for these particular options. And again, I'd like to just clarify that we're not claiming that these are the only options for sexuality. These, again, are a starting point to help collect more accurate data. So because the additional updates to the gender sex item and the addition of the sexuality item have been in place since 2016, we now at NADA have some data on how services are using these items and the updates. So happily, in terms of sexuality, the proportion of clients who have been asked or have had their sexuality recorded by services has increased since 2016. And even in 2020, so far, 12,501 clients have had their sexuality recorded in NADAbase. But since the sexuality item was introduced in 2016, unfortunately, of the clients who have had their sexuality recorded, 35% have had this noted down as not stated or inadequately described. And this is consistent with the figures we have so far for the last financial year in the data from NADAbase. Now, there are several reasons why this might be the case. And some of this may be that the sexuality question is just not being asked to these particular clients. And I guess one of the reasons for this could be that perhaps staff aren't comfortable asking someone about their sexuality, or maybe don't see it as relevant to that person's treatment. But we're hoping that what we've gone through in this webinar will show that actually this information can be important. And while it's certainly a really good point that sometimes it's not exactly relevant to what's going to benefit that client the most, there are some cases where having this information can help connect that person to resources, other services, that kind of thing. It can help to give a lot more options for that client and maybe help address some of the issues they may be experiencing. Also, it's entirely possible that that person's sexuality is not included in the drop-down menu that's currently in NADAbase. And like I said before, we're seeing these options, this new item for sexuality is a starting point. And so you may be familiar with a sexuality called asexuality. So this just means, and this is just my perspective, so there might be some disagreement about this, but asexuality just refers to a person who may not experience sexual or romantic attraction to another person. There's some argument that asexuality may actually be on a spectrum, but again, in the future, NADA may work to include these other options, but so far we just have the bisexual, queer, and gay, homosexual, lesbian options available. And also lastly, it's entirely possible that the client may not feel comfortable disclosing their sexuality to the staff member that they're speaking with. And really, a lot of that is tied to making an environment that's more comfortable for the person and they feel that it's safe to disclose that information if it's required. So we'll turn now to gender. So as I mentioned before, sex is a mandatory minimum data set item. So there's actually no missing data for this particular item in NADAbase since 2016. However, less than 1% of clients in this time period have been recorded as having a sex or gender identity that is not male or female. Now, in 2016, the Australian census, they found that much less than 1% of the population identified as a gender other than male or female. Now, with this, I wanted to talk briefly about what we need to consider when we look at these types of statistics, because with the census in 2016, it's possible that there was a measurement error or measurement bias. So one of the things that makes it very hard when you're talking about clients who identify as LGBTQI is that we don't really ever have any solid data on how many clients, or in fact, how many people in Australia actually identify with these particular identities. So it's hard for us to know if these proportions that we're finding in NADAbase actually reflect how clients identify, or is it that we need more information or better ways for them to be able to express their identities. And it's also possible that some clients and people in general just aren't comfortable disclosing their gender or sexuality identities, and sometimes that's absolutely fine. At NADA, what we really want to encourage is that if clients are going to disclose this kind of information, it's more related to their treatment or the service that's being delivered to them, not that it's mandatory, not that they have to give out this information. And really the other thing to consider is that if we have the options available to collect this data, it really helps us to be more representative or have better representation of the experience of LGBTQI people. So some of the things that you can do in your everyday work could be something as simple as providing opportunities for clients to be able to disclose this information if they feel comfortable doing so. Is the service a welcoming environment for an LGBTQI client? And will the privacy and confidentiality of that client be assured? So now we're going to hear from a member's perspective why it's so important to ask clients about gender and sexuality.
On the broad spectrum, hopefully, we've only just started asking the question, and it's my understanding not everyone is asking the question. But let's say in a year's time or 5 years' time, I might be able to tell you that women between the age of 18 and 24 who identified as queer were much more successful in treatment than women who identified as queer between the ages of 40 and 45. So that I know as a treatment provider, when somebody identifies as queer and they come into New Beginnings, maybe I need to have a bit more consideration about that. It's about being able to trend data and look at data. We can look at a lot of different subsets, but we don't have data for AOD, queer, LGBTQI people. And that robs my community of the opportunity for better treatment. I get concerned when we deem gender and sexuality questions a sensitive question. That is a question that is very relevant to that person, and is also, to say that it's sensitive implies that it would be offensive to ask somebody who didn't identify or who did identify as heterosexual or not as trans, and covering that whole topic. And these questions are asked so that we can have a conversation with our client about where our client's at and what that looks like. There's nothing, it's like asking them what their cultural background is. It's like asking them what suburb they've come from. It's like we ask them about family and domestic violence histories. We ask them about history of arson, history of suicide, history of self-harm, mental health, what type of drugs are you using? Those are deeply sensitive questions. Asking somebody about their gender and sexuality, I get a bit nervous coining them as sensitive questions. And saying that, I understand how people who haven't been in that space and used that language would be a bit uncomfortable and not be maybe unsure of how to ask that question. And I would support those people and those organizations to get some training about it. We have an LGBTQI lunch, a rainbow lunch, every Tuesday. All the staff members and clients that identify attend that lunch. So I attend that lunch, and we were speaking the other day about asking the question, and one of the clients said to me, "Sarah, it was really great when they asked me, because I knew then when I was coming in that they knew I was gay. I didn't have to come in and out myself to everybody." And it also allowed for me to have that conversation about, the rainbow lunch being there, or being assured that this is a safe space before coming to treatment. So, sometimes gay people or people who identify on that rainbow can have an additional hesitation and barrier to treatment. Whereas we're asking them on first contact and able to alleviate all of that. And for people that doesn't apply to, no drama.
And now we're going to take you to some role plays that will explore all that we've discussed so far in asking the question around gender and sexuality diversity. Hi there, and welcome to these role plays. So now what we're going to do is build on what you've been hearing so far about asking the question. And the most important thing that you can do is to be human. Sometimes we make mistakes, and that's absolutely okay. It's best to acknowledge those and always be thinking about the ways that we can make our clients feel comfortable. So I'm now going to demonstrate to you asking the question in regard to gender and sexuality diversity. Hi Kylie.
Hello.
Welcome to NADA. I know it's sometimes a bit daunting to come along to an appointment like this, and I want you to know that we're here to support you in any way that we can. Can I get you a glass of water or anything? Would that be helpful?
I'm okay, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So part of what I need to do today is to ask you a few questions about where you're at, how you're doing, to sort of explore a little bit about the ways in which we can support you best. And I suppose sometimes the questions I might ask you might feel a bit confronting, and you can always say that you'd prefer not to answer them. You can also ask to maybe explore that a little bit later on. But we ask the same questions to everybody that comes into our service.
Okay.
Okay, so I want to start, I've got some of your personal details here, but I do want to ask you specifically about how you identify. And the first one is around your gender or your sex. So we ask everybody this because we at NADA are a very inclusive service, so we can have people coming here from all different types of walks of life. And so how would you identify? Male, female, as a transgender female or transgender male? And sometimes people might identify as being how would you identify?
Currently, I identify as a cisgendered woman.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
A queer cisgendered woman.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's great. Now, the other question I want to ask you about is how you identify in terms of your sexuality. For some people, that's a really important part of their identity, and certainly it helps us too in terms of some of the supports that we might consider in terms of your treatment here.
Okay.
So how would you identify in terms of your sexuality?
Say I'm queer.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's what I feel most comfortable with.
Great. Excellent. I'm going to make a note of that. And so with how we create your care plan alongside you, these are some of the elements that might become really important.
Yeah, for sure. How I felt about that, I guess initially I was unsure why you were asking me that question, because I was here for something that I didn't see this as a queer organisation or me coming in to talk about that, but once you asked it, I get that it shapes who I am, and therefore the way that you might be able to support me better and the services I might need to access beyond here and the experiences that have led me to this point, I guess, are very much my sexuality is and gender is part of that. So I think it's really important that you asked it and that we can continue the conversation.
Hi there, Tata.
Hi, Suzie.
So glad that you could make it today. Did you find it okay?
Yeah, it was good coming here.
Okay, great. Now I know it can feel a bit daunting being here today, and I'm going to spend a bit of the session today just finding out a little bit of information about yourself and what brought you here. We ask the same questions of everybody who comes to NADA, and it's really important for us to understand the ways in which we can support you, but also for you to know that we try very hard to create a safe and inclusive space here at NADA. And when I ask you some questions, they're quite personal, so if you prefer not to answer, you can absolutely do that, or perhaps you might want to explore that at another date or another session, and that's okay too. Okay?
Yeah.
So I've got a bit of your personal information, but one of the things we ask people is how they identify, and that helps us to really understand and collaborate when we're building a bit of a case plan or care plan for you about what is the best treatment approach, and then also what other types of support services might be useful. And so one of the first questions is around how you identify in terms of your gender or your sex. So for some people they would identify as male or female. They talk about it being cisgender, so how they were born. Or some people might identify as trans woman or a trans man, or sometimes also people might be non-binary. So how would you identify yourself?
So I'm female, I'm cisgendered female.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about your sexuality, and that really is to give us an indication of how you identify in terms of how you see yourself. It could be that you identify as being heterosexual or bisexual, as a lesbian woman, or it might be that you identify as queer. How would you identify at the moment?
I would identify as heterosexual, so I'm straight.
Okay,
Yeah.
fantastic, thank you.
It was weird at first that Suzie was asking me about my gender identity and sexuality, because I've never really been asked that question, because it's always been assumed that I'm cisgendered straight because of how I look and how I present myself. But it's good to know that that's something that can be asked in this service, and it's welcome. It's a welcome environment for everybody who walks in the door.
Hi Rob, welcome. Did you find it okay getting here today?
I did. Thank you.
Good. So it can sometimes feel a little bit strange when you first come to a service, but today our session will spend a little bit of time exploring a bit about you and what brought you here, and it helps us to understand the best way to support you. We ask the same questions of everybody who comes here, and some of those questions can be quite personal, so sometimes it might be that it feels a bit confronting, and you can always decide not to answer those questions, or we can explore them at another time. Okay, so I've got a little bit of personal information about you, but I did want to ask you how you identify. So we ask people about their gender and their sexuality because it helps us understand how they identify themselves, and also what types of supports might be useful for them as part of their treatment or beyond their treatment as well. So it's important that we ask those questions and don't make assumptions about where you are in terms of your identity.
Yep.
So the first question I want to ask you is about your gender or sex. And so some people identify as male, female, they might be trans male or trans female, and some people are non-binary. So how would you identify today?
I identify as a male.
Okay, thank you. The other question I've got is about your sexuality, and so that's how you identify in terms of yourself, how you are with partners or potential people, also in terms of community, because it can be quite important for people. And so how would you identify yourself today in terms of your sexuality?
I identify as a gay man.
Okay, and in terms of pronouns, so before you were saying you're a male, and would you be comfortable with me referring to you as him or they? What would be preferable to you?
Him is fine.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
So it was nice to be asked those questions. I guess it clarified between the relationship with me and my therapist straight away about where I stood and how I identified. And so I think that was quite useful.
So we've been exploring through this webinar lots of information around asking the question when it comes to gender diversity and sexuality diversity, and we've looked at the reasons why and the ways in which we can through some role plays. We've spoken to service providers, and now we really feel like it's important to speak to consumers of services. And I'd like to now welcome MJ along. So thanks for being with us, MJ.
Thank you.
And MJ, what I wanted to ask you about was really what have been some of your experiences in treatment, being someone who identifies as gender diverse.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that's been like for you?
Yeah, look, in recent years, I've had several different sort of experiences through treatment. I think probably the most recent was a couple of years ago, and it was a really difficult situation. I went in there identifying as a trans woman, but I hadn't started HRT yet. I'd been through the therapy and all that sort of stuff, the pre-therapy, and the particular rehab that I went into wasn't accepting of that, and it was a very large rehab, and they separated me into the men's section.
Right.
And
so
then,
it was a male and female play.
Yep. And even though they never asked questions to me, but I had to say I identify this way, and that was never comfortable with that service.
Right.
Yeah.
And so even though they had not asked you, and then you were having to provide that information, but then they didn't respond in the way that you had hoped they might.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. And so what did that mean for your experience of the treatment then?
Well, when I was first there, they sort of excluded me in the male section, isolated me, and I guess they always had me sort of a little bit more separate, like trying to have some sort of care in that, but it sort of it didn't let me go. I felt like I was fighting through the treatment process for my own right, or you know, I felt a lot of injustice in that service.
And so then it's very difficult, I suppose, to engage in the treatment that's being, you know, provided to you, because you're actually having to fight for your identity and being seen and heard. And,
completely. Yeah, it was really, really difficult.
And have there been other types of experiences that you've had that have been different to that?
Yeah, look, I had a recent experience probably about 5 months ago, and that was through another short-term service of 28 days, and I was going in there as a transgender woman. I've been on HRT for almost a couple of years, and so, but I went in there, they accepted that I was transgender. It was only a small service, and there was only a few women, and I was separated like with the women, but we also had a really combined, it was a combined therapeutic community.
Okay.
So it was really comfortable service for me, and it sort of, it didn't discriminate between genders or, you know, or who you were. So. And
so that then enabled you, I suppose, to really do the thing that you were there to do.
Yeah.
Which is to get support for your substance use and the bits and pieces.
Yeah, and I found I got a lot of support through that service, like through the 28 days that I was there. So it was a really good foundation in my recovery today.
That's great. And so with that, do you feel like there might be a difference, you know, about if people don't ask the question, particularly around how people identify in regard to their gender and their sexuality? Why do you think that might be important?
Just because I think for me as a person, like I feel like I'm not visible, and like I'm not known, like I'm just not a person, and I think that feels really quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I suppose it's that thing too of these assumptions that people can make, and perhaps sometimes their own discomfort perhaps about not knowing the best way to be. What sort of advice do you give to people if they are feeling a bit unsure about asking those questions? What would you say to them?
I'd be more forward with them, and sort of in a just nice way. Just I think even people can get confused with, you know, all pronouns and am I queer, am I transgender, and you know, who am I, you know?
Yeah, so, but I suppose what you're saying there is that with not asking, you know, you can always choose to not answer that question or to answer it in whatever way you want, but not asking it has you feeling a bit invisible.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so in terms of thinking about why it's important, you've talked a little bit about that identity, it's who you are. Any sort of other particular advice that you would give to services, particularly around these things of asking the question and being more inclusive in terms of gender and sexuality diversity?
Everything should be, so I think I know for myself it's been a journey, and like I identified queer for years, and even going into a treatment service back years ago, like I mean, I never had any of those opportunities or questions, or and it's always like they made a choice where I went to, and
okay, so those choices were sort of taken out of your hands because you weren't able to have the conversation about it.
Yeah, and I think people, because it's maybe uncomfortable, is then ignored. Yeah.
Right, and so I suppose what you're saying then is that, you know, while the discomfort sits with the other person, not perhaps with yourself, and that without asking it, you don't get to explore those things, or have those doors open to you that might have you go, oh, well, actually, I haven't thought about that. You know?
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And so now, having had those positive and not so positive experiences, what do you think, in terms of workers who are out there, are there things that they could do differently? I mean, you've talked about asking the question, sort of, creating that space. Are there other things that people could do to make it more comfortable for people from different backgrounds?
Oh yeah, I guess even like in the rehab, like activities and groups and things like that. There were some that I felt completely left out in, etc. because it was all about sport or or they went to go play sport and I'm not sporty, and just didn't sort of include things sort of like in my area, which I would know about, or
Yeah, and so I suppose in that case it's really so important to open the door and say where there's some flexibility in the program to be responsive to lots of different people's needs.
Yeah, completely.
Right.
And I think too, it's really important to sort of ask all these questions, and because then I think it makes people feel more comfortable with you, and then they realise there's actually nothing different about you than them, and just identifying with the similarities and not the differences. Yeah.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you so much,
That's all right.
MJ. I really appreciate your
That's
words
okay.
of wisdom. What I think MJ is really hitting right on the head is that it's so important to open the door and create a space for people to talk about how they identify, to talk about what matters to them, and to ensure that they feel like your service is, at the very least, if you don't have all the answers yet, that you're open to thinking about being flexible and responsive to the needs of the people that are with you at the time. Thanks so much for joining us. In a minute we'll go to question time, but I do want to flag with you a number of really helpful resources that specifically target being more inclusive around LGBTIQ people or people who identify as gender or sexuality diverse. Certainly there are the AOD guidelines that were produced by ACON in partnership with us at NADA. There's also a fantastic e-learning package that new staff or current staff could find useful in exploring how to ask the question around sexuality and diverse, encouraging sexuality and diverse clients to access your treatment services. There's also the NADA Gender and Sexuality Diverse AOD Worker Network. We'd really encourage any person that identifies to get in touch with that group and be a part of that. And indeed, that group did put on a recent webinar specifically around providing inclusive AOD treatment.
NADA has a lot of great resources available for you to help you in your collection of data on gender and sexuality with your clients. However, I'd also like to highlight ACON. ACON is a health service that offers support to the LGBTQ community. And I'm actually in the middle of completing some Pride training with ACON at the moment. So the training I'm doing is the inclusive practice for LGBTQ communities. Now I've found this training really fun. It's very inclusive, very engaging. You learn a lot of history about LGBTQ people in Australia. You learn about some of the bias and stigma that this community faces. And I've just found it all overall a great experience. It's also a safe space, so it means that if you do have any questions about terminology use, why you would use pronouns, you can ask those questions, and currently the hosts that are running the training for us, they've been really, really helpful. So you can go to the ACON site, the website, if you'd like to find out more. I'd also like to remind you that NADA has some workforce development training grants available. So if you did need some funding support for completing training with your service to help you in your work with LGBTQ clients, those grants are available for you. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have learned a lot today. Now it's question time, so please stick around if you have a question.
Hi there, everyone. And so I hope you found that useful. We really would like now to think about some of the questions that you have put through to us. So one of the first questions we have is around tips on how to make the physical environment more welcoming to people from LGBTQ communities. Now, as was indicated by MJ in the previous role play, one of the things that's really useful is to think about signalling to people as they come into your service that they are welcome there. And so what we often would say is that you have perhaps the rainbow flag in the foyer, that you perhaps undergo the Pride training, which would also give you some more tips about being genuinely inclusive and signalling that to people. The other thing to really think about is around say facilities. So specifically, if you have a residential service, that there is the opportunity for people from gender diverse backgrounds to access toilets and showers that are for them. So you've got that option there for them, particularly if you have a service that is gender inclusive, so meaning that you take people from all backgrounds. There are a couple of things, but the other thing I picked up from what MJ was saying is it's useful to think about how flexible is your program. So when you look and you perhaps look at it through the eyes or via the lens of someone from a gender diverse or a sexuality diverse background, what might be some of the things that don't feel as inclusive? And so sometimes what we would recommend, and certainly through consumer engagement, you can actually ask those people themselves, what is it that they see in the program that might need a little bit of tweaking to just be a little more inclusive? So there's some of the things to really consider. But I suppose the other thing to really keep in mind, and I think this came through in a lot of the conversations, is that don't be afraid to acknowledge when things aren't quite right. And that means that perhaps when you have someone coming through your doors, if you ask the question, you can also be asking them to contribute to your program or service if they notice things that aren't quite working for them or don't feel as inclusive or supportive as they might be. It's really about being open to that feedback. I think that's the most important thing that we can say to members and people out there, is that sometimes we don't always get things right, and that's okay, but it's better that we ask the question and then we can respond in ways that could be helpful. Another question that we have indicates that it's from Katerina. She is indicating, we believe our service is very inclusive, so why do we need to still ask the question specifically? And we would agree that a lot of our member services and services out there do really well in this space. The reason for also asking the question, though, is twofold. One is absolutely so that you're able to ensure that you're providing a safe place for people who do identify from gender and sexuality diverse backgrounds. But by asking the question of everyone who comes through the door, you're being inclusive of perhaps people who may well not have got to the point where they are clear for themselves about where they are at. It opens the door for the potential of those conversations that maybe they haven't felt comfortable in the past to explore. And the other thing it does is it signals to people who may not be from a gender or sexuality diverse background that this is a safe place, and therefore they need to be aware that all the groups, perhaps, or the therapy will be attending to those things, and that we would hope that they, as being part of a community or coming to a service, will be respectful of people, of all people that are coming through the door. So asking the question enables open communication and us to respond to things, and it also helps to signal to the rest of the community about what the expectations are around respect and inclusivity. Another question here indicates that discussions with participants concerning gender and sexuality are obviously important to tailoring treatment and supporting them. However, are there concerns over keeping records of these, particularly considering the the Australian Psychological service have requirements such as an organisation may only solicit and collect personal information that is reasonably necessary for one or more of its functions or activities. Sorry, Australian privacy principles. Thanks, Simon, for that clarification. So what we would say there is it, once again, it's a conversation to have with the client. So you might ask the question and then you might reiterate that this is being, where it's being recorded. So for example, as you may know, both the minimum data set and the national minimum data set do not currently have room or a provision for questions around sexuality. And they certainly have limitations in terms of gender diversity. And we as an organisation, and certainly I know others, are really trying to push hard for that to be included, because we know that that data's not, it doesn't have good coverage, and there are issues with that. But it would be to sort of nominate and let the person know, do they feel comfortable with that? So that would be the first thing. So we're really clear to them about where the information is being kept. And similarly, in relation to the recording in, say, case notes, it might be that you start to reflect on your policies around this. So, for example, it might be that what someone's birth certificate indicates, or perhaps their prior inclusion in a program has them identifying perhaps as one gender, and maybe they've come back and it's a different gender. And so sometimes it's useful to discuss with them how you might best record that, so that those records are contained together, or at least they're linked together in some way. But certainly I think the most important thing is just to discuss it with the client themselves and see what they're comfortable with. But certainly what we would recommend is that in order to do a really comprehensive care plan, it's important to ask those questions and to have it inform the treatment that you're providing. Another question that's come through is, I understand that gender and sexuality is fluid. So how do we capture that in the data we collect? Do we change this even when a client is engaged in current treatment? So I think once again with that situation, it's about asking that person where they are at. During the course of an episode of treatment, there is provision to edit the record in terms of gender and sexuality. And it may well be the case that as a client becomes more comfortable in a service, that they might indeed disclose information to you that they hadn't at that first point of intake. And so once again, it would be about discussing that with the client, that as they entered the service, they might have identified in one way, in one perspective. Now that has changed, are they comfortable with that being changed on the record? So I think really be guided mostly by the client, but you're quite right. It really is about where that person is at that particular time. And so it might be worth revisiting if indeed it comes up during the treatment itself. I think the really key thing to do is to be not afraid to talk with your clients openly. And that is to say that most of the people that I've spoken to really are welcoming of people asking the question, as long as they have been made clear about why you're asking, and that it's done in a really respectful and open manner. Once again, it's also about letting people know that perhaps they might not want to answer that question today, but that you might revisit it at a later date. And so really the most important thing to think about is respect, being open, being inclusive, and being responsive. We really hope that today has been helpful to you in terms of why you would ask questions around gender and sexuality diversity. We encourage you strongly to start to sit with your team, to talk about what your current practice is, to review that and ensure that it's as inclusive as possible. You can contact us at any time, and other specialist services such as the Gender Centre, who are members of ours, or ACON, for further advice, training and support in these areas. There's some brilliant resources out there and great examples of everything from policy to e-learning to training. We look forward to welcoming you to the next session and hope you have a great day. Thank you.